You say kiora, we say aloha and mahalo. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks, Dave, who worked so hard to handle all the logistics of this. Suzanne and Carissa and others that are here. I'm really honored to be visiting this campus. I think this is now the third time I've come to the University of Auckland. It's been a delight every single time. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about your work. Unfortunately, normally, and some of you know this, if the class is small enough, we go through and get to know a couple of the students and then kind of can go from there. And I did that in Alice's class the other day, but it was Marilyn, right? Yeah, as Marilyn can attest, and apologies, Marilyn, you will have seen a few of these slides, but I don't, in the hour that we have the time to do that, but I always am interested in what students are doing and why you're here. So I hope this is a presentation of interest to you. This is a book, this is the cover of a book that colleague Nikki Jones and I wrote, and we wrote it in response to what we were seeing in the media. So I'm glad that Suzanne is here with her colleagues from the Media and Film Studies program, because this really starts as a media story. And I'm speaking of the media, one of my favorite sources of information about how bad things are and how particularly bad girls are is Newsweek magazine. And what I want to say about corporate media is that in the old days, the news hole problem, if you will, in journalism was really that you had so much fine journalism and so little space in which to put it. And imagine, Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post and the halcyon days when they were exploring Richard Nixon's misdeeds. That's the old news hole problem. The new news hole problem is we have people like Rupert Murdoch and Fox News, and they have to talk to you and produce products that you might buy that have none of that kind of reporting. So the news hole problem is what to put in the news that you will buy that will not make the rich or the powerful at all uncomfortable. And so what have we come up with? Ta-da! Celebrity journalism. The entertainment system, endless outlets to talk to us about people that we shouldn't care at all about. Think the Kardashians, okay? Why are we even talking about these people? Well, the interesting thing is, in addition to celebrity news, there was one other kind of news that the corporate media was eager to embrace, and that's crime news. And with, who are these people, by the way? You know who these are. This is Brittany and Paris. And these young women were not only celebrity mavens of a certain period, but they're also both young women whose behavior got them criminalized. Now, unlike the Marilyn Monroes and Ava Gardners of their day, who had drug problems that everybody knew about, there was no surveillance of the criminal justice system in their lives. So it's kind of an interesting turn that we've taken here. But I'm going to back up. We're going to hop into the Wayback Machine a little bit to where I got started thinking about this, which was actually when I started doing research on gangs. And this is actually a clipping that Karen Jo Laidler sent me from Hong Kong. And one of the things we were struck by, both she and I, looking at the media constructions of girls and gangs, and just to point out that it's not just the U.S. here that's involved in this, and it's also New Zealand, is that you have this construction in the media suddenly of young women, and what you're all bright and intelligent students. What's common about all of these images that you're seeing? What's going on here? In terms of, let me give you a little clue here. Ethnicity. Are any of these white girls? That one's let's look at this one. This is a very common image. Girl peering over barrel of gun, right? It turns out girls in gangs don't use guns. So we'll start with that. It's wrong. But that doesn't stop the media from concocting the image again and again, because it does some very important things to the reader. First of all, how exciting. Let's look at the girls will be girls thing here. When you hear the phrase girls will be girls, what do you think of? Do you think of a girl wearing a mask and holding a gun? What are we thinking of? prissy, dressy, kind of frivolous little girls will be girls kind of stuff. What they're doing here is very intentional. They're positioning the menacing, scary black girl against the imagined white girl. So this is girls will be girls, but then somehow we get some girls carry guns, some girls hide razor blades in their mouths. That isn't an image that comes to mind when you hear girls will be girls. So for the first time, the readers in the US and elsewhere are seeing images of young women of color, but they're a very important and negative message about these young women. They aren't a positive message. Now, you white girls might be feeling like the media isn't paying attention. Wait. Where's our... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. We're still staying with the bad girls. But we're going to go now. One of the reporters that I worked with is at the Boston Globe. This guy's name is Royal Ford. One of the things that's frustrating about being a criminologist in this area is that you talk and talk and talk to these reporters, and Alice and I talked about this. And at the end of the day, this is a success. He's off the gun thing and on the knife thing. Okay, that's a success. And if you can read in the black there, and both Randy Sheldon and I, who wrote the book on female delinquency, were frustrated by the fact that the best we could hope for was that we could get them, a little more factually correct, but they're not going to give up on the hype. They are not going to give up on the hype. I have had a rare exception, but most of the time, what I want to hear is that girls are meaner, more violent, and more bad than they used to be, okay? Now, the irony in this particular slide is that this appeared about the time of the Columbine shootings. And we have a shift really in discussion about that time. We have a pivot in the discussion of kids' violence in the late 90s. And we pivoted from the gang panic and moral panic that we were having as a nation to another panic. Did we have a panic about, okay, let's go in the Wayback Machine, Columbine, what happened there? Anyone know? Outside of Denver, middle class, high school, any ideas?
2 white boys shot a bunch of girls.
Bravo. Because they were white, did we talk about their ethnicity as a country?
Of course not.
No. Unlike, not at all unlike the situation in Las Vegas. We can't talk about Pollock's ethnicity because he's white. So what is he? The media, they've explained to us, he's a lone wolf. If Pollock had been black or Latino, do you think we would have said, oh, he must be a lone wolf? No. So the first thing you understand is we can't talk about the race of the young men who did this. We cannot talk about their gender because why? They're men. We don't talk about white men in America. So we can't talk about that. Can we talk about guns? I love it. Nope, can't talk about guns either. So what do we talk about? We talk about kids and violence. And so I watched this narrative shift from the gang narrative, which we had, to this kids killing kids, and of course, bad girls along the way. But now again, you white people might be feeling a little bit neglected, especially white girls. So here's something for you. You may not be violent, but what are you? You're mean. Now, there's been a literature on this, but let's back up and realize that, again, the media loves the mean girl narrative. We just had the Mean Girl Day a couple of days ago. Was it last week? Steve's daughter, who was in, what grade is she in? Like
13, I think.
She's 13 years old, and she knew about the Mean Girl Day. So the media loves the mean girl thing, and there's actually some science around the mean girl stuff, but I want to unpack it as a way to show how you do good social science and how good social science is important when you get these things. Now, I listened to the mean girl stuff driving in. I used to live in the country, and I was listening to this interview with Rosalind Weissman, and I thought, I just hate this research, and I'm not sure why. So I did have to plunge into it. And here's the deal. Basically, what the mean girl research was first based on was research done by Nikki Crick at the University of Minnesota, was done using 6-year-old kids. And it was looking at what psychologists call behaviors that are intended to harm. And that means anything from I shoot you to I roll my eyes at you is considered aggressive behavior. So that, as a criminologist, was already a little bit of a what? And then the second thing is I am an eye roller. So I suddenly realized, wait a minute, this has been one of my professional survival mechanisms is when I'm in a horrible situation, it's really important that I have a friend that I can look at and go, can you believe what we just heard? And it's usually an idiot boss that's in front of me, saying this stuff. And I have to sit in the back of the room because, I'm going to be busted if I'm any closer. So I already knew that these were the tools, or could be the tools, of the powerless. And so I was weirdly troubled by this idea that somehow eye rolling and rumor spreading and even just knowing stuff about the social networks in which you live was equated with the kind of direct aggression and physical violence that we criminalize in New Zealand and in the States. So, but anyway, this is the narrative is that girls specialize in indirect aggression, boys specialize in direct aggression. Boys will just, slam you in the face with their fist. Girls are going to roll their eyes at you and not invite you to their birthday party. And that if you include these together, girls are as aggressive as boys. Okay. The only thing wrong with this is the science begins to unravel as you begin to push at the data a little bit harder, and as you look at older groups of kids. And so I think really, and without getting into the weeds here, there's a really good study done by scholars at the University of Georgia. It was a longitudinal study following kids from 6th grade, so no longer 6-year-olds, but 6th grade to 12th grade. The first thing that they noted was that 96% of the students in the study reported that they engaged in relational aggression, and 92% had been the victim of relational aggression. Now, you're all social scientists. If 90-something% of people are engaging in this behavior, what do we call the behavior? Normal. Okay, so it is not to say it's great, but it's to say it's a part of life, and it's very, very common. But let's drill down a little further. We find out that if we look a little more closely, boys engage in more of this behavior than girls do. And girls are more likely to be the victim, not the perpetrator. And finally, if you look at the meanest kids, the one who fell into the high relational aggression group, 66.7 were boys and 33.3 were girls. Well, now, if you think back a second, and my husband, who used to work in City Hall, said, when I was first talking to him about this research, he said, anyone who's worked in City Hall knows that men engage in this behavior. And there's the worst thing that any politician can ever tell you is, I'm behind you 1,000%, because they aren't. So I think what it is that boys catch up. So it's not that Nikki's work was wrong, it's that if you add in other groups, if you begin to look at other measures, you find a very different and complicated pattern, but it's not this girl or these girls. It's a much more interesting and important story to tell. But now what about, and the last thing, as a criminologist, I was a little worried about focusing on relational aggression because we were going to police girls in schools. And we're going to say, we're going to, be telling girls to be nicer to each other and doing anti-bullying stuff like that. So that was another piece of this research. But the other thing was that we looked at, Mary Morash and I and Katie Irwin looked at research trying to figure out if relational aggression is related to physical aggression, and it turns out it isn't. So, but let's talk a little bit about physical aggression, because the media are also hugely interested in this story. And I think these girls are wearing school uniforms, if I'm not mistaken, right? So this is scary. Oh my God, New Zealand is, overrun by marauding groups of girls beating up on other girls. Here's another one. It just goes on and on. You're terrorized, but you're not alone. Here we are getting terrorized in the Chicago suburbs. So, and then if you want to read a little bit about girls and violence, you can. Here's some stellar pieces of research. I'm going to get in trouble now. I'm head of American Society of Criminology. I might run into this guy. I have run into the gal who wrote Odd Girl Out. I feel bad about that because I kind of like her. She's a nice young woman. But I think the work is misguided. And there's no question in my mind that this is misguided. James Garbarino, who wrote a not bad book about Columbine and the Columbine boys, argues in this book, his book, See Jane Hit, which is what a great title, girls' sports participation has increased their aggression. Well, just the reverse is the case, but it doesn't matter to Jim Garbarino, and everybody plays on that sugar and spice, girls will be girls, and those researchers on the left are from Harvard, so shows what I know. The last thing, I'm not a genius, I think, or maybe I am. I mean, Donald Trump is worrying about his IQ. I don't know if you saw that this morning. I'm like, anybody who has to talk about his IQ is already in deep kimchi, as far as I'm concerned. All right, the first thing about this is another media construction. 1 in 14 girls involved in violence. Oh my God. But notice that we get down, and I've increased the size so that you can understand that there's always beyond the gender message, there's almost always a race message. And the race message is that when we really drill down, those really violent, really scary girls are girls of color. And that's what this message is in this slide. And up here is the cheerleader beating video. I don't know if that made it to New Zealand. We had a media mini firestorm about these. And I had People magazine on the phone to me talking about, this quote unquote beating. And and it was a guy, and I said, let's stop right here. If this were two boys engaged in a little slap fest, would you be talking to me on, about this topic? And he had to sheepishly say, no, I know I wouldn't be. And I said, why don't you ever talk about the good news about girls? And there was this long silence. And he says, is there any good news about girls? This is the problem. We'll get to that. All right, but the message here in this kind of media framing is very clearly that when you're talking about the behavior and violence that we criminalize, not the mean girl stuff, but the other stuff, we're talking about kids of color. So this is how I launched my career looking at violence and young womanhood. And that is how your research career, if you're a critical criminologist or a public criminologist, you're really engaged in having to respond to, and especially in this corporate media era, media frames about kids as much as you are trying to do original research and figure out what's going on. So, but the first thing you do is, of course, you're reacting to both race and gender constructs in the media, and then you're saying, well, what do the facts show? And some of the facts do look like something is going on, and something is going on, but let's look at why the reporters were calling me so frequently. Because when I started this research, kids in the juvenile justice system who were female were about 1 in 5 of those in the system, and particularly at their rest point. And by now, they're about 1 in 3. So we've gone from 1 in 5 to 1 in 3. So girls are a much bigger story. And this is also an important story for those of you who are going to work in that system, because it's a system that does need to change, because it's a system that used to deal with the problems of boys, maybe not with a conscious notion about gender and masculinity, but it was a system designed to handle a world that was much more masculine than the current world that's there. The second thing is you see the same pattern in New Zealand arrests, basically, that girls are an increasing share of those who are appearing in your system. And now here's a slide that we can take a little time. Wait, got to go back here. Both of these slides tell kind of the same story. What I don't like about these whiteboards is you can't see my cute little red dot. But the overarching, this line here is juvenile arrests. So are juvenile arrests going up or down in the U.S.? Down. They're going down. So the first thing about the moral panic about kids and violence is that overall arrests of kids in the U.S. and in New Zealand are going down, not up. I try to tell legislators this all the time, because they assume, because they watch the news, that crime is out of control and getting worse and worse and worse. But now let's look at the gender lines, because this is the boy line and this is the girl line. What's the difference between those two lines? This is the boy line. It's in the 9s here. It's in the 7s over there, right? What about this one? In the 3s, in the 3s.
Much steadier for the girls.
Yeah, the girls are pretty much holding steady. the crime drop that has been seen in juvenile arrests in both the US and New Zealand is a boy crime drop. Now, we really need to, as criminologists, figure out what happened over the last couple of decades to the things that were propelling boys into the system. Much of the thinking in the US has to do with drug markets, but I don't think that's the whole story. But it's an interesting story that we don't know the answer to. But what we do know is that whatever the forces were that are working on boys and bringing boys into the system are a different set of forces than the forces that are working on girls and girls' lives and bringing them into the system. And those didn't change as much, and as a result, you see those two different patterns. You see it also in another slide looking at drops in male and female arrests by type. And you notice that overwhelmingly, boys are dropping at a faster rate than girls, and particularly in the area of person offenses. So that is a bit of a clue. Let's look at what happened to girls' arrests looking at one specific offense in the States, and that offense is a thing called simple assault. Now, simple assault is what's commonly referred to by people who look at FBI statistics a lot as a kind of garbage category. Anything and everything can go into it. It's why it's in Part 2 offenses, not Part 1 offenses, because with aggravated assault, and there's some noise there as well, they have to be pretty serious assaults. You have to almost be assaulted to the point of death. But simple assault can be almost anything. In fact, kids can simply be arrested for being present at a fight. And that sometimes happens and surprises young people. But if we're assuming, and remember those images earlier of the girls in the school uniforms and enraged groups, running down streets of New Zealand neighborhoods, that this is wild girls going out of control, then you'd expect that occasionally, and I don't mean to be frivolous about this, but if we take an offense where it's very clear what's happened because there's a dead body, like murder, that you would see the same pattern, and we don't. So again, what science tells us is when the data don't line up, when things that you expect to be correlated aren't, then something else might be going on. Here comes the graduate student experience. These are the things I think explain what we're seeing. Upcriming, relabeling of status offenses as criminal offenses, particularly assault, and rediscovery of the fact that girls have always been more aggressive and violent than our stereotype permitted. Let's start with that Columbine situation. So, a bunch of kids have been shot by some white boys in Colorado. We can't talk about masculinity, can't talk about whiteness, can't talk about guns. Let's talk about zero tolerance in schools for violence. This is a huge driver of what we've seen in the States in terms of arresting girls for assault. And what happened in Hawaii, and I think probably happened in many jurisdictions around the country, by the way, zero tolerance means any violation at all, you go right to the most draconian response possible. They tried that with driving offenses among adults, and there were a couple of other efforts around the country in the US to do this. And what happens when you ticket people if they're going 5 miles over the speed limit? They go like, oh, right, busted. What happens? Anybody know? Anybody have any idea what happens when you do this to adults? Do adults go gently into that good night? They get pissed off, okay? They get really irritated. And people eventually ended up taking they called them the Talibans, because they had these vans on the Poly Highway. Everyone's going faster than the speed limit going down the Poly Highway. And people got ticketed. And, they're making a bleep load of money off of these tickets. But there was this terrible reaction, and people said, stop it. Kids don't have that kind of political power, so when high schools started telling people, I'm going to bust you for taking a plastic knife to school to spread peanut butter on your sandwich, they would get busted for having a weapon. Girls would have Midol in their backpack, and they would get busted for having drugs. So and they removed the principal's ability to kind of, intervene and say, oh, look, this is silly. How I know this with greater detail is that I had to do a study of juvenile robbery because our juvenile robbery statistics went off the charts. And lo and behold, we'd put police officers in schools, and basically they were labeling. Well, we did the research on juvenile robbery, and the average amount stolen from the victims was $2.75. And I'm having to interview these guys in the robbery detail, and they're like, get us out of this, because they were being called to schools. Because kids were, basically in Hawaii, we call it hijacking, where groups of kids are taking money from other kids. Not nice, shouldn't be happening. We don't need the juvenile robbery detail down here, okay? It's obvious. That was zero tolerance. And when you put cops in schools and you tell people, anytime you see anything that could reasonably be called a crime, call the police, that's what happens. Another thing that's happening is very interesting. It has to do with domestic violence and mandatory arrest. And it has to do with the fact that more and more girls and women are being arrested for these offenses than previously. There's a complicated story here, but I don't really have time to get into it past saying that batterers have gotten quite savvy. Once mandatory arrest became a part of the political and social landscape, men who really understood how things worked would manage to have some injuries when the police arrived. And they could often count on getting their girlfriend arrested in what's called mutual arrests. But what the upshot was, this was a statewide study in California, the number of girls and women arrested for this offense tripled. There was another study looking at the fact that our stereotype about domestic violence is that it's all intimate partner violence. And that's not true. I grew up in a violent home, so I could have told you that. In violent homes, everybody's hitting everybody. And parents are getting hit by their kids, and parents are hitting their kids. And in this political environment, and this is a really good study that Eve Bazawa did, what they discovered was that 47% of domestic violence was not intimate partner violence, it was other family violence. And particularly parents arguing with their kids, and most specifically, daughters arguing with their parents. And why aren't sons arguing with their parents as much as girls are? Can anybody tell me that one?
Because they're not policed as much as the girls.
Nobody cares about their son. In the class that Alice had, a young man volunteered the fact that he doesn't have a curfew, but his sister has a curfew. So parents are policing their girls, and when they get pissed at their girls, they get extremely pissed. So the girls are much more likely, even than their violent brothers, to get arrested. Finally, I knew that we'd been asking every 2 years kids what they'd been doing over the past couple of years. So this is self-report data. Now remember that scary figure that 1 in 4 girls was violent? Well, that's right. That's what these data have shown for the past couple of decades. I knew it because the early research that I did on girls and runaway behavior indicated that girls were engaged in a much wider array of delinquency than their official statistics used to show, which was that everybody was either incorrigible or a runaway. Well, now everybody's an assault person. We've simply relabeled those arguments that you had with your mom at the door from incorrigibility to assault. But are girls getting more violent? We ask kids, these are high school kids in the US, and we asked them that same question. Have you been in a physical fight in the last year? In 1991, how many girls had been in a fight? It's a pretty big number, actually, isn't it? 31%? I know this is a little scary, a little hard to see. This is 34%. Okay, what's the number over there, Dave, in the 2015? 16.5. Now, I've been showing you nothing but media images about girls going wild, girls going bad. Here are the data on what's actually happening to girls and their behavior. It's a complete opposite message. How about those boys and violence? There's an interesting story here that we don't tell and don't know about, and it's called the decline in violence among children. It's pretty consistently going on, and I'm amazed at how it keeps going lower. At some point, you'd expect these things to bounce around a little bit. So, this is kids' behavior. Why are those assault arrests flying off the charts? Who else is involved whenever there's an actual arrest made besides the person perpetrating the offense? As soon as you engage in a criminal behavior, do you whip out your own handcuffs and put them on yourself? If you don't, then somebody else does, okay? So the question is, whenever there's a behavior that is getting criminalized, one source that you need to look at behaviorally is what's happening to the kids who are engaged in the behavior you're looking at. And the other is the person who's reacting to that behavior. And that was the study that Mary Morash and I did in a piece we did for Justice Quarterly. And in this research, we basically took two different national self-report studies, both of which had asked kids essentially, have you assaulted anybody in the last year, and have you been arrested for that behavior? We had two different studies from two different time periods, 1980 and 2000. Nothing about the behavior changed over the 80 to 2000 in terms of the kids. But what changed over that period was a dramatic increase, basically in the likelihood that people would get arrested for the behavior, or for the girls who would get arrested. In 1980, girls who engaged in self-reported or said that they had assaulted another person stood a 1 in 4 chance of being charged with a crime. By 2000, that had shifted to 3 to 4. So from 1 in 4 to 3 to 4. For girls of color, the shift was 7 times more likely, not just 3 to 4, but 7 times more likely. So what we're going to suggest here is that the behavior of those observing kids has changed, and we're much more likely to punish kids, particularly girls, for acting out. So this is a classic example, if you know your sociology, of what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy. Even if things are wrong, if you act as though they're true, they are real in their consequences. This was a terrible incident that happened outside a swimming pool, basically, in the great state of Texas. And what we suggest here is that people, particularly police and school officials, have changed in their dealings with girls, and particularly girls of color. We certainly see that girls stay in the system. This is a over 20-year period, and basically between 1985 and 2010, the number of girls in court populations went up by 68%. Boys barely budged. So again, we've seen a huge run-up in girls' share of the juvenile court attention. These are other data that Fran Sherman just recently pulled together for the Crittenden Foundation. Among other things, she notes that girls' share of all parts of the system have increased. So, for example, in the girls' detention facility, basically the kids going to detention used to be 15% were girls. It's now 21% are girls. And they're in detention for very minor offenses. So it's not simply that girls are in the system, but they're in facilities where pretty bad things can happen to them. And here's an example of a bad thing that happened to a young woman, 16-year-old girl, got in an argument with her mother. Police responded. She was charged with assault, taken to a detention center. She had never been in a detention center before, so she resisted taking off her clothes, was restrained by several officers, and then placed in a cell by herself. She was found dead the next day. So terrible things can happen when we put girls in facilities for these kinds of minor offenses. This is a picture of a young woman who was in Paris, Texas. She was sentenced to her minority. She was then 14 years of age for shoving a hall monitor. So she was shoving a hall monitor. She's the daughter of a civil rights activist, so luckily in her case, her mom got Jesse Jackson involved, but otherwise she would have been in Texas training school for 7 years for shoving a hall monitor. Kids of color are disproportionately overrepresented in the patterns that I'm describing. So even though the number of kids in facilities overall has been going down, the disproportionality has been increasing, and girls are a big part of that story. And in our state of Hawaii, and Dave knows this because he did some of the early research, an overwhelming number of the kids in our detention centers and training schools in the islands are Native Hawaiian. And by that I mean like 50, 60%, not a little bit. It's a lot bit. What could we do differently? I know that we're running short on time, but this is a wonderful a colleague of mine. This is Marion Daniel. She says we need to look at gender responsive programming. And I love this quote. For years, people assumed that all you had to do to make a program designed for boys work for girls was to paint the walls pink and to take out the urinals. And I literally went to a prison that had been built for women outside of Fresno, and I was talking to the warden there, and she was laughing, and she said she went on a tour of the facility, and she said everything looks great except to take out the urinals. So it can happen. This is a system that has been designed, both the juvenile justice system and the adult criminal justice system has been designed for boys and men. Now, what we did, and what Marion Daniels did, was she started a female-only probation caseload approach, which worked remarkably well to get girls out of detention in Maryland. In Hawaii, we've started, and it's been successfully evaluated by two of my students, Lisa Pascoe and Janet Davidson, a thing called Hawaii Girls Court. I do have data on it, but I'm going to slip past those slides. It'll just say to you what we did here was we took what we knew about females and girls, and we said, if we put that at the center of what's going on here with these kids, and we looked at runaway behavior, and we tried to look at how we can reknit family relationships. We put girls together with other girls, even though that can be a little bit tricky. We worked with the girls' parents on issues around this whole business of policing and over-policing your daughters, trying to reknit and deal with if there's abuse or histories of abuse, dealing with those kinds of issues, mental health issues, trying to get them reconnected with school. Frequent monitoring is a part of the story here, and that can be a tricky bit when you're doing these kinds of interventions, but in this case, it really worked rather remarkably. So there's a whole bunch of slides there saying just that, okay? So just trust me on this. We want to do things like Girls Court because we want to keep kids out of facilities of the sort that I was describing earlier so that we don't have the kind of terrible problems that we've had. In the States, I don't know how this is in New Zealand, but in the States, we really do not do a good job of monitoring the conditions of youthful confinement. Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention does not do this, despite what you might imagine, which means that we have terrible problems that do crop up. We have Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International looking at the conditions of our youthful confinement. That's never good. This is a picture of the U.S., and there's my great state of Hawaii. All the green states are states where we've had scandals of one kind or another. In Hawaii, we've had major problems with sexual assault among the girls who are incarcerated at our youth facility. Here's just looking at youth incarceration rates, and certainly the U.S., as usual, we're number one in incarceration, I hasten to add, which is not a good number one to be in. But number three is New Zealand. So you're trailing behind South Africa. So welcome to the club. So we definitely need to talk about doing different kinds of things. And just in conclusion, the global conversation about girls has not been about bad girls or violent girls. It's been about Malala Yousafzai and about advocacy for girls' education and for them to live lives that are free from early marriage, forced sex, and domestic violence. And I just think it's fascinating in conclusion that what we've seen in our discussions of girlhood has been such a departure from that conversation, where we're not talking about how can we make girls' lives better, how can we give girls more choices, but we're engaged in this kind of other conversation completely. So, spread the good news about girls. I haven't had time to do that for you, but I'll just say two words. Title IX, which in the U.S. has meant an enormous increase in the girls' participation in sports. And unlike what James Garbarino argued, it's actually turned out to be remarkably good news for girls to participate in sports. So all of those of you who did that, your lives are better for it, and those data come in quickly and early, and they are sustained well into the, basically middle age because of the health benefits of physical exercise, because of the autonomy and resilience that sports programming has always given boys and men and is now giving girls. So we need to also challenge the journalism that I characterized earlier, which is kind of a thankless task, as Alice and I have lamented, because when you're telling journalists stuff they don't want to hear, they're really irritated with you. But there it is. And advocating for gender-responsive programming, for those of you who are in the system or are going to be going into the system, we do need to change the game, and we do need to figure out what will work for the kids that we're going to be working with, and it's going to be different. I would even argue that it would be interesting to think about masculinity more in delinquency prevention consciously, and ask yourself questions like, is football the best thing to put these kids in to keep them out of trouble? Just the physical injuries alone are caution. But I remember having to look at, people who were putting kids into boxing. And this was in a gang neighborhood, Waipahu. And, I got a lot of information about boxing because when we said, really? Boxing? I've learned, discipline, really good for you. But it's still, I think it's an issue that we might want to talk about in terms of boys programming but we definitely know that sports programming for girls is a thing to consider, but that you might want to also consider, and in fact, some of the best programs are ones that help kids with literacy, help kids who have trauma backgrounds talk about what happened to them and in their own terms and in their own words. So my student, Brian Bilski, is working both in New Jersey and in Hawaii, going into kids' detention centers and getting kids to basically giving them help with literacy and letting them have an opportunity to tell their stories.